Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. I'm Indu Saxena, joining with my colleague, Mr. Mangesh Sawant, a senior researcher and fellow at CIPR. Today's session is focused on assessing the one-year rule of the Taliban in Afghanistan. 1 year on, the challenges of the Afghan people have grown exponentially, and the crisis is looming large. Nearly 23 million people are food insecure, and more than 2 million children suffer from malnutrition. A report that UN resident and humanitarian coordinator in Afghanistan, Ramiz Al-Kabaro, who visited the country in June. The Taliban's fight with resistance forces, with other ethnic groups, and the emerging threat of terrorism, mostly with the Islamic State of Khorasan, have accentuated the misery of Taliban and its shadow on its ambitions to be an emirate. On the other hand, the Taliban's restrictive policies and behavior towards women, religious minorities, journalists, and the personnel of former Afghan security forces make it difficult to be a legitimate rule and to differentiate between bad Taliban or good Taliban, or a transition from Taliban 1 to Taliban 2. From all the reports and analysis, we can see that Afghanistan under the Taliban rule is far from a stable and secure future. For this pertinent and timely discussion, we have stellar lineup. Let me introduce our today's speaker. We have Dr. Hayat Alvi. Dr. Alvi is an associate professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. She served as the director of international studies at Arcadia University and taught political science at Egypt, Cairo from 2001 to 2005. She is an expert in security and strategic studies, terrorism and counterterrorism, conflict resolution, genocide, and her research is focused on MENA region and South Asian studies. She has published numerous books, articles, and chapters. Her recent volume is Nonviolent Activism in Islam, the Message of Abdul Kalam Azad. We have Dr. Mehmed Ali with us. Dr. Ali is the director of Air University Academic Services. Before this, he served with 6 federal agencies, including tour as a Marine back in the 1980s and in 90s, and as a diplomat in Iraq and Afghanistan, while also working at the several civilian institution of higher education. So he has an extensive perspective of the topic from inside and outside. And then next we have Mr. McLain Gill. Mr. Gill is a Manila-based geopolitical analyst and author who specializes in Indo-Pacific security affairs, India and Philippines foreign policy, and South Asia region. And he has written more than 100 articles and interviewed by various international TV channels. I welcome you all here at this discussion. And before I hand over to my colleague, Mr. Sawant, I would like to mention that the views expressed and presented here are personal and should not be constituted to any institutions. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Sawant.
Let me begin by saying again, thank you for inviting me, and also repeating the disclaimer that everything I say represents personal views only. I also want to recognize in the audience Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, who is from Afghanistan and has the title ambassador. So hopefully he can chime in when we have time to have discussion. So, and Ambassador, thank you for joining us. So I took your title of Crumbling Afghanistan, 1 year of Taliban rule, and I tried to make the theme of crumbling Afghanistan throughout the presentation. So what I want to begin with is the consistency of Western policies towards Afghanistan, and also including the Russians or Soviets during the Cold War and their policies. So we're looking at it from two views: the Western view, or I should say strategic and political approach to Afghanistan, and the Russian-Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So it begins with, and you can see this in the movie or the book, Charlie Wilson's War, with pretty much the very last scene of the film, where after the Soviets invade in 1979, the United States supports along with allies and partners in the region, supports the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet invaders, and this is in the context of the Cold War. In class, I teach students to think in terms of strategic ends, ways, and means. So for the Soviets, what are the strategic ends or goals or objectives, and the ways and means they wanted to achieve them in Afghanistan in the Cold War context? And then, of course, the Reagan administration and again, partners and allies in the region, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and a few others, but those are the primary ones who have their ends, ways, and means to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. So the last scene in the movie, if you remember, is that Congressman Charlie Wilson is in front of the congressional board or committee that has the authority to continue or end our United States involvement in Afghanistan. And Congressman Wilson, makes the plea or the appeal to the committee that please, now that the Soviets have withdrawn, let's not abandon Afghanistan. And literally the committee members close their books and notebooks and walk away. So this is why on the bottom I say mission accomplished, pack up, leave, wash your hands. You're going to see that consistent policy later on as well. So where are we after that? Once the Soviets withdraw and the United States washes its hands and pulls out because mission has been accomplished of kicking the Soviets out of Afghanistan, the whole country falls into the civil war. Then you see in 1996, the rise of the Taliban, again, no reaction from the West, and nothing, not a word in terms of official policy or condemnation about the Taliban's initial policies and ruthless oppression of females in Afghanistan back in 1996. Then we fast forward to the 9/11 attacks. You see the US campaign in Afghanistan, rightly to go after the Taliban and particularly bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. But we make a partnership with the Northern Alliance, and a lot of them have been war criminals themselves during the Afghan civil war. So we have to think of that as well and scratch our heads. Then we have a diversion. In 2003, we have the US invasion of Iraq, and that takes a lot of resources away from our campaign in terms of the focus of ends, ways, and means regarding our campaign in Afghanistan and placed into Iraq. So we see an ends, ways, and means confusion. Are we nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan at that point? Is it just counterterrorism, or is it counterinsurgency, or all of the above? And then all of a sudden we see on the political stage, especially in the West, women's rights in Afghanistan appears kind of magically, but it's really a political strategy or a political utility. Again, no one really cared in 1996. That bottom picture of the execution of the woman, that is the infamous soccer stadium where the Taliban converted the soccer stadium or football stadium into the public grounds of execution. And one of their first victims was a woman. So fast forward again to February of 2020, what happens again, you have political kind of game playing. You have the Trump administration that sets up a secret agreement with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar, and it becomes known as the Doha Accords. I'm not going to read this the whole slide, but just be aware that even with the next administration, there was an escape clause where the Biden administration could have scrapped this whole deal and started over, especially if they felt that the Taliban were not going to hold up their end of the bargain. The third bullet here, it says Vice President at the time, Joe Biden, during the Obama administration, always wanted US troops withdrawn from Afghanistan. So when we think of cognitive beliefs and cognitive policy for a head of state, in this case, President Trump, for the Doha Accords, which excluded the legitimate government of Afghanistan from those negotiations, and then the cognitive beliefs and policy of Joe Biden, that he stuck to the consistency of his position from the Obama administration to now of withdrawing US troops. So this is, you can call it a rational policy on the part of these presidents, but there's a lot of cognition involved as well. And then the bullet further down that says, why trust the Taliban at all? That's my personal approach to this, because in this Doha Accords, there's a tendency or the impression that we take the Taliban for their word, to keep their promises, to keep their side of the bargain. And, they're not known, they don't have a track record for being trustworthy. Fast forwarding again, I would say, when have the Taliban have ever shown good faith in their policies? And you have to also remember that their policies, the Taliban, cloak their policies in religion as they, in a very warped way, interpret religion. So they might, for necessity and utility, give what the negotiators want to hear in the negotiations, but in reality, they're going to stick with whatever they want to do according to their religious beliefs. I want you to look at the purple wording on the far left, because from the Doha Agreement, it gave the Biden administration the green light to withdraw and say we're following the stipulations of the Doha Agreement. The nature, manner, and fast pace of the United States withdrawal contributed to the violent chaos and opportunities for terrorist attacks. And nature, manner, and pace of the US withdrawal intensified the Afghan people's desperation, knowing that the Taliban would easily take power in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And countless Afghans at that time were and continue to be very vulnerable. A lot of them worked for the United States and ISAF forces in Afghanistan, and the Taliban pretty much know who they are and are targeting them and have targeted them. The question that is begging is this: how could the pre-existing situation and situational awareness on the part of especially the United States allow anyone to conclude that peace would be the outcome for any options for courses of action before the Trump and Biden administrations? And we also have to ask the question, peace for whom? Are we talking about peace for the Afghans? Well, any analyst on Afghanistan would have told President Trump or President Biden that this is not going to be peaceful for the Afghan people. But is it peaceful for the United States to withdraw our troops? Of course it is. And so again, I'm not going to read all of this, but just to give you an idea of what have been the crumbling variables for Afghanistan since our withdrawal. There's no economy, there's no trade, there are no resources, no foreign direct investment, mainly because there's no stability and security, no agricultural production that's worthy of supporting a population, no health services, no rule of law or administrative functions or basic government. Girls' schools have been closed, especially secondary education on up, despite promises by the Taliban not to close them, and the dress codes are reimposed. Women have lost jobs, rights to education, mobility, and basic agency. Women have lost their agency. And then I give you some quotes and sources from the Council on Foreign Relations regarding, again, the dire situation in Afghanistan at the moment. And I go on to give you that. And then on the far left bottom, a Council on Foreign Relations has a breakdown of who are the current Taliban leadership. Who do they consist of? And if you look at each and every one of them, they're all dubious characters. Some of them coming directly from terrorist organizations and terrorist backgrounds, especially targeting Western, particularly American troops at the time. On the right, you see the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan web link, RAWA. They're outstanding, and they have a very proactive documentation of the abuses of the Taliban, as well as the Northern Alliance. But if you're interested in some of its graphic details and images, but if you're interested in the activism of women on the ground, RAWA is one of the most proactive organizations there. And then this is a recent picture on the bottom right, Taliban assaults women protesting. What we're seeing now is that different from 1996 to today, is that today women in Afghanistan have tasted the flavor of freedom and rights and choices and agency, and they're not sitting quietly about it. They are confronting the Taliban. They are protesting in the streets. And just yesterday, there are headlines of huge numbers of women in Afghanistan protesting for women's rights and in solidarity with women in Iran because of what's going on in Iran as well. So we have come full circle with regard to what has happened in Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion. And let me add that for the decades that since the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, I have been saying very vocally that it's really, when we go back to follow the breadcrumbs of all of this, the Soviets/Russians are at fault here. They were the impetus for the crumbling of Afghanistan, if you connect all those dots. And really, the Afghan people, they deserve reparations from the Soviets and Russians. I don't know how successful that would be, but that's my personal opinion. So there's a great NPR article of August of this year that talks about some of the details of the degradation of Afghan society, in addition to the list I gave you earlier about the crumbling economy, the risk of starvation, especially women and children, destitution. You can see destitution in Afghanistan. Girls are still forced out of school. The media and freedom of speech and expression that Afghanistan used to have is now completely muzzled by the Taliban, and it's only a small group of Afghan women who still loudly protest at a steep price of detention and beatings. So that's my presentation. We have come full circle, and I don't know if you sensed in my tone that I'm angry and I'm upset and I'm emotional about this. I have followed Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion up to now, and I continue to follow it. And this whole coming full circle back with the Taliban in power is very, very upsetting to me personally. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayat Ali. It was an interesting presentation. You provided all the parameters which have led to the present quagmire in Afghanistan. It's a city, a civil war is going on. There's a breakdown of law and order. It's a failed state. You have all the spectrum of the conflict playing out there. And thank you very much for providing the historical context and starting the presentation with a movie, because it gets lively when you present something with a story or a movie. Thank you very much once again. The next I invite Ambassador Mehmed Ali to make the presentation. Hello. Can you hear me, Ambassador Mehmed Ali?
I think he's frozen.
Dr.
Yeah,
Ali?
he's frozen. I think we can come back later. We can start with Don McLain Gill.
Yeah, surely. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Don. How are you?
Yes, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, great to have you. You would be.
I guess.
Doctor is back here. Doctor is back here. Ambassador Mehmed Ali, we would like you to start your presentation. I think you got frozen in between.
Please unmute. Unmute, Dr. Ali. You are muted.
Thank you. Sorry, just when you did that fabulous, fabulous introduction, my signal went completely dead. So apologies for Uncle Sam's Wi-Fi extraordinaire. So thank you. What I'd like to do, and that was a terrific overview, Dr. Halvi. I thought I could maybe take off from some of your things and offer a little bit of concurring ideas and maybe even a different take on some of that. Not as a critique or anything, but another thing that that is missing in your list of all the ills that are happening is even more horrific stuff. Like just last week, 53 people were killed in an attack on a Hazara school, mainly young girls, again, from some force that does not want to have equal rights for all genders, does not want to have education for females, because somehow this is haram in their twisted version of their interpretation of Islam, or however they're framing it. I do concur that the economics of the Taliban rule are, again, the sanctions notwithstanding. Again, when revolutions are led by people that frown upon formal education, that look down upon people that maybe have a higher status, I think the course of history always proves that there's nothing good that comes from this group. If you look at the Khmer Rouge, for example, the extreme agrarian left-wing revolutionaries that took over Cambodia and ran the country from 1975 to 79, which led to the deaths of approximately 1.5 to 2 million people. And their target group of people to kill were the educated people. The people, they went around and felt your hands. And if your hands were too soft, that means you weren't part of the working class. If you wore glasses, these are the things that caused them to eliminate people. So Taliban is not necessarily as extreme as the Khmer Rouge, but their lack of understanding of sort of the worldscape is quite evident. I read a news story the other day. They have recently crushed all cryptocurrency in the country, again, as I think on a purposeful note that the anything sort of new, anything innovative, anything that connects them to the rest of the world is somehow looked down upon. And so it's, again, concur with all your points. Today, just a couple hours ago, there was another attack at a mosque at the Ministry of the Interior. And I don't know if they've come up with the death count yet. But the Taliban are quickly proving that they're unable to run an effective government, help lead a society. I'm heartened to see what's happening in Iran. I'm heartened to see the bravery that women and men who support are doing in both countries, and I pray that they will have some success. Dr. Alvi, I wanted to sort of take some of your thoughts and twist them 1%. You know, you have a critique of the Soviets, which is a due to them. I also want to give credit to the Soviets for trying to remake a nation when they invaded in '79. We did not try to go as far as the Soviets with revolutionizing the society. The Soviets did a lot to bring equal rights to women, to try to push education, and lots of development projects from the Eastern Bloc, from East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, I think, had some projects. In the time of the Soviet rule and the Republic there, they did a lot to try to work to bring a better society. Again, I'm not a fan of communism. I don't think it's a failed ideology and a failed policy. And yet there was many things that I would say all of us could look at and probably say are a positive thing. The rule of that time, I think, is could be equated to the rule of Amanullah, the emir back in the 1920s, who tried to, like Ataturk did in Turkey, in the post-Ottoman Turkey, to format society, have a more secular outlook for people, and focus on education, and essentially make religion a more private sphere than a public one. Ataturk was able to do that. Amanullah tried, but was then in turn overthrown by the conservative forces within, with probable British backing, etc. So the United States and its allies did not try to do the revolution that the Soviets did in the 70s and 80s. We did a lot of good things. You know, I was there. I was working with the provincial reconstruction team in the province of Khost, in the eastern mountainous area along the border of Pakistan. One of my colleagues came up with a good plan to do private schools for girls. So not a sort of a public school in the middle of downtown, but a school for young women at a private residence to sort of take the eyes off of it. We had quite a bit of success with that. And a number of other health initiatives that benefited women and children and families, educational opportunities, et cetera. But we certainly did not try to revolutionize society at the level that the Soviets and the Republic did during the 70s and 80s. And I'm not sure we could have done it. And I'm not sure if we should have done it. Because again, even if you're bringing great ideas that I think most of the world agree upon, when someone comes in and invades your nation, it takes the precedence in the minds of the people. So I don't have any deep analysis on the current situation. I think there's, as a historian, I think there's some indicators that the Taliban will probably be there for quite some time. I'm not optimistic that sort of other forces will unseat them. I think we can all guesstimate that the path that they've sort of set up this first year back in business will continue, and that the rights of the people will continue to erode. and that's very unfortunate. I also think the time of revolution to change the society has come and gone, and I'm not sure if there's anyone else that's going to pick up that cause that the United States and its allies attempted to do for 2 decades. So I think we've reverted to a time where we'll have to work with whatever means we can through the international community, through diplomatic channels with soft power, and try to get some through maybe the United Nations, and get some level of eyes back on Afghanistan, and do the subtle pressure as we do in many corners of the world, whether it's focusing on human rights abuses in China, or you fill in the blank, even to take a look at ourselves as here in the United States, and make sure we are ensuring full civil rights for all of our citizens and residents. I think the historical narrative is still awaiting its development, and it'll be interesting to see what the second year of the Taliban rule, how that unfolds. Thanks very much.
Am I allowed to respond real quick?
Absolutely.
Is that okay? So a couple of things. First of all, what the Soviets did was genocidal. What they're doing in Ukraine is probably the tip of the iceberg of what they did to the Afghan civilians. Regardless of what they did to bring freedoms and rights to women, that what they did to the people of Afghanistan is genocidal, and Afghan people deserve reparations and deserve Russia to be brought on trial or to justice for war crimes against the Afghan people. Secondly, Afghanistan has traditionally been Sufi, or very genteel in its Islamic tradition. It's Pakistan and Saudi Arabia who injected the very violent Wahhabi type of Salafism and jihadism in the context of the Cold War into Afghanistan, and the country has never been the same since then. And then finally, when we had the U.S. troops in Afghanistan, the female Marines, the female engagement teams, the FETs, were specifically told that they are not allowed to mention female or women's rights or human rights in their engagement with local Afghan women. So there's a lot of double standards there, but I do not agree that the Soviets did anything positive for the Afghan people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks
Hayat
for
Alvi.
your inputs on that, Dr. Alvi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayat Alvi and Ambassador Mehmed Ali. It was an interesting presentation, and thanks for providing a comparative analysis in the realm of revolutions. I would call upon next to Don McLain Gill to make his presentation.
Thank you so much. And of course, thank you for the kind invitation. And I also would want to thank my distinguished co-panelists, Dr. Alvi and Ambassador Ali, for really setting the tone and mapping out comprehensively the fundamental importance of what is taking place in Afghanistan at the expense of the Afghans in terms of socioeconomic security and stability, as we see the Taliban gripping closer in terms of the maximization of power in the country. Now, I would like to add, of course, a little particular angle amid this overarching dynamics of the crumbling of Afghanistan. In fact, I'd like to also take off from Dr. Alvi's incorporation of the level of trust, the issue of trust, and of course, the ability to make decisions vis-a-vis that level of trust. Now, in doing that, I would like to, base it from a particular perspective in the region, particularly looking at the geopolitical decision-making trends from the perspective of India in the context of an India, Taliban, Pakistan triangle. Now, given, of course, the problems that have been taking place since 2021, particularly the level of food insecurity, socio-economic degradation, violence against women, minorities. This is in fact very catastrophic at the expense of the welfare and growth of the Afghans. Now, looking into the geopolitical decision-making perspective, of course, we could see that the Taliban tend to have this particular desire to strike an ambitious balance between gaining domestic and international legitimacy on one hand and maintaining ideological interests on the other. Now, this seems to result technically in a very arduous, inconsistent, and unpredictable national and foreign policy, which then comes towards the exacerbation of the welfare of the Afghans. Now, while the Taliban, they were highly dependent on Pakistan for resources and accommodation after 2001, today at a time when the Taliban are seeking to achieve domestic and international legitimacy, it is realizing that it cannot continue to keep all its eggs in the Pakistani basket. Whereas in 1996, Pakistan was one of the first countries that recognized the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. Today, it's a lot different because of the level of interdependence and the fear, of course, of committing strategic faults at the expense of domestic political, economic stability. Now, the Taliban has acknowledged, of course, that India has cemented its position as a major development partner of the country and has earned the goodwill of the Afghans with its people-centric approach. Now, however, as we can see, what is happening now is that despite the promises that were being made for an inclusive, people-centric government in Afghanistan, the situation is in fact the exact opposite. As my distinguished co-panelists have also mentioned, this is in fact something of a very, as we can say, this is very temporary and artificial in terms of their promises, but the reality really is the inability to really set aside their ideological goals at the expense, of course, of the welfare of their people. Now, given its geographical proximity, economic size, military capacity, and of course, robust diplomatic network, India has served as a crucial and palpable component in the Taliban's quest for internal and external legitimacy. Now, to set its tone and to really make that bid to seek for legitimacy and demonstrate more autonomy, the Taliban have been engaging activities that challenge Pakistan's desire to maintain an uncontested degree of influence over Afghanistan's affairs. In fact, Taliban have openly expressed their discontent towards Pakistan's attempts to undermine their development and relations with India. Now, two particular striking developments have been taking place since 2021 vis-a-vis the Taliban's relations with Pakistan and, of course, its corresponding agencies such as the ISI. Now, the Taliban's support for the TTP and, of course, a displeasure with Pakistan's delay in trade and the rejection of the Durand Line are some of the critical developments that have been transpiring since their return. Now, on the other hand, the Taliban have expressed their desire towards a stronger presence of India in Afghanistan development, India's support for training Afghan troops, and the support for regional trade, for that matter. Now, India has, to a certain degree, reciprocated to a certain extent by providing humanitarian assistance, reopening its embassy in Kabul, and sending its first official delegation to Afghanistan in June this year, which really paved the way for the delegation to interact with Taliban officials. Moreover, while India remains invested in the people of Afghanistan, geopolitically speaking, it will have to proactively engage with the group in power to facilitate long-term convergences without directly granting legitimacy to the group. And for that matter, and most importantly, I'd like to highlight is that India must maintain a position that factors in the potential of future uncertainty. And in fact, Dr. Alvi has rightfully mentioned the role of the interpretation of religion as a way, and what I've emphasized on the level of ideology, which is in fact arduous for the Taliban to balance with their desire for material gains and the welfare of their people, or the welfare of the Afghans. So the Taliban may be showing significant accommodation towards India in terms of attaining their material interests. However, there is barely any evidence that the Taliban have the desire to marginalize or abandon their interpretations towards their ideological interests. So, regarding the 2020 Taliban-US agreement, as Dr. Alvi has also mentioned, evidence indicates that the Taliban continue to prioritize their relations with groups such as Al-Qaeda and really honor the pledges of allegiances made by key members of Al-Qaeda to Taliban leaders from Mullah Muhammad Omar to Haibatullah Agunzada. So additionally, the Taliban have also chosen to backtrack on their commitments towards maintaining an inclusive, people-centric, rules-based system of governance, despite the fact that it realizes that through these processes and procedures, will they be able to have the slightest chance of attaining international recognition. But then again, the level of interpretation towards their ideological interests serve as a significant barrier for really any coherent, straightforward, and of course, long-term roadmap towards domestic and external policy. So as we can see, for that matter, the Taliban's backtrack, of course, on the support of Pakistan in the past, while accommodating the TTP, and of course, similarly with China, China has in fact espoused its interest to really invest billions of dollars, future investments in terms of the resources in Afghanistan. But because of the Taliban's continuous engagement with the ETIM, for that matter, there seems to be a rather ambiguous relationship between Beijing and the Taliban as of today. And similarly, the Taliban continues to sympathize and maintain an ideological connection with fellow Deobandi groups. So such linkages in the past have compromised the security in Kashmir, for that matter. So the Taliban's desire to really balance, this is my end note, is to really balance that material interest with the interpretation of ideological interests really comes at the expense of the Afghans and creates more instability and incoherence in terms of regional connectivity and regional security, for that matter. So given the situation that we can see that the Taliban seem to be here to stay for at least the midterm to long term, while also in line with the Ambassador Ali not being quite optimistic about these particular developments, the international community will have to forge a proactive policy that would be able to leverage on the needs of the Afghans, while at the same time providing more constraint towards the Taliban in a way that would not further exacerbate the situation at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gill, for an insightful outlook on contemporary developments. Next, we will go on to the Q&A sessions with the experts.
I would like to interrupt a bit because we have the Ambassador Haidari, so I would like to listen from him, like how the former diplomats, ambassadors, and former Afghan officials who have been like in the Western countries, how they have been reacting the situation of 1 year of Taliban rule. Ambassador Haidari, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to attend this very enlightening conversation today. Great presentations. But we should also point out a few recommendations, policy recommendations, not just for folks here in Washington under the Biden administration, the president himself, but also for the rest of the world, especially Europeans within the NATO context, and as well as those in the ACO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We just met, and some of the key issues on their agenda happen to be terrorism, extremism, separatism, and drug production and drug trafficking, all of which have converged and entrenched in Afghanistan. So we have to tell them what to do. Whether Afghanistan, where it is, as it was explained, is acceptable for the region, foremost for India, China, Russia. These are the key members, and also Iran joining SCO. And I would, of course, two of these in the P5 Permanent 5 of the United Nations, and as well as for this administration, whether it's going to come back again or whether Republicans will take over in Afghanistan, where the United States spilled blood and spent so much treasure. We're still early to reverse what has happened over the past year. Of unfortunately undoing what we had together accomplished over the past 20 years. And genocide, as Dr. Ali pointed out, and as happening, it's real when each of these attacks happen and the Taliban tolerate, and it is specifically targeting a specific ethnicity and sect of Islam, Shias, and then specifically targeting women and girls, and specifically those who are getting an education. Think about that, just much more ruthless than one can think of. And then this happened repeatedly, mostly in the same area. And this particular educational center was hit in 2018 and it was hit again. And also let's recall that if now folks blame this on Daesh, did we just forget that the Taliban had been killing Afghans and wounding by thousands? UNAM was very clear, the reports that used to come out showing that the Taliban were responsible for, roughly killing 10 and wounding 10,000 Afghans a year, which is, as a genocide or terrorism scale. That's our reaction in a nutshell, that the situation is that in Afghanistan, it shouldn't be acceptable, the status quo to foremost our neighbors, which have been criticizing the presence of NATO, pressuring us to ask NATO to leave, and that's what we did. Of course, that's why the focus of the Islamic Republic was to, have a solid peace process, which would produce a political settlement that would form an inclusive government, including the Taliban. But unfortunately, we heard from Dr. Alvi on the Doha process, which was a process to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. Some people talk about surrender or capitulation. That's not true. The NATO could stay the course with less than 2,000 special forces and those enablers that the U.S. Mostly provided through contractors, and the rest of the fighting and dying had been done by our forces since the end of 2014. So it was just a matter of continuing to spend roughly between $4 to $6 billion to maintain and help, strengthen what had been a developing democracy. Corruption, yes, I criticize heavily the two presidents who should have done a lot, President Karzai and President Ghani. But corruption, as we know, is a symptom of weak governance, and that's a symptom of, weak stateness. Remember that when we took over from the Taliban back in 2001, there was zero stateness. Afghanistan has always had a strong nation, versus our neighbor, which is a weak nation, but strong state in the military intelligence. That's why they've been able to, unfortunately, bring out the situation that we see in Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan, we have had a strong state with 5,000 years of history, but weak states and many invasions from distant past to now, aggression by proxy, basically sponsored by the Taliban. So we are together. The missions, some have left, some missions have closed, purely because of a lack of resources, but others are still clinging on to the Islamic Republic, defending our values we share with the rest of the international community, the core national security interests of maintaining sovereignty, independence, freedom of Afghanistan, of course, calling for increased support for a national resistance that has grown, starting from northeast of Afghanistan, that now is moved toward the east and south, and of course, in urban areas, increasingly women are leading the way, but that's also expanding. But the international community should listen to us. We're basically telling them, and I recently wrote an op-ed to say that the situation today in Afghanistan is returned back to the pre-9/11 condition. Back then, it was the same situation. No one cared. The Clinton administration said the economy is stupid. Why we should stay in Afghanistan? And Dr. Alvi pointed it out. But we saw that the situation in Afghanistan brought about 9/11 that re-engaged the United States. In a nutshell, right now we have the Taliban sheltering Al-Qaeda. We saw the leader of Al-Qaeda, al-Zawahiri, killed right in the neighborhood of the presidential palace, harbored by Sirajuddin Haqqani, another FBI blacklisted, UN-sanctioned terrorist minister of interior of the Taliban. And ETIM, focusing on China, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, focusing on Central Asia and Russia. Daesh itself, of course, with a black flag, is not necessarily organic Daesh from the Middle East, but it's mostly the Taliban themselves, probably also partly an alternative exploited by ISI to keep the Taliban in check, and also to put pressure on the Taliban each time the Taliban listen to the Afghan people and make certain policies that deviate from, the strategic design of the neighbor. It's very complicated. And so human rights, women's rights, unfortunately, are worse. Women are isolated. Schoolgirls are banned from secondary education. Thinking about the, sustainable development goals, the rest of the international community has subscribed that. Here, Afghanistan is the only country where SDGs is no longer happening, and that has a direct implication for regional stability and international peace. And humanitarian crisis we see is compounded by the impact of climate change. Afghanistan within South Asia, which South Asia itself is the most vulnerable region of the world to climate change. And within this region, Afghanistan is the most climate vulnerable country. And as a result, Afghanistan is also prone to earthquakes. So we see the complexity of humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, with 20 million Afghans, hungry, with 3 million kids malnourished, with 9 to 10 million Afghans facing a famine, and we have a harsh winter coming as the war in Ukraine is happening, and of course depriving the poor of the world of energy and food, and that's what we see in Afghanistan. The only thing that we get from the international community is in the form of this cash flow, $40 million or so, on and off, and as well as whatever the United Nations has been providing. I used to work with the UN in Afghanistan and in Central Asia, and it just provides a basic, the basics. It's a bag of wheat flour and 5 kg of edible oil and 1 kg of sugar. So you now think of a family of 10. What do you do with that kind of aid, and how many people you can feed? So literally everyone is starving, everyone is jobless, and Afghanistan is a youthful population. Youth have no prospects, and then the country is rife and washed with terrorists and drug traffickers and human traffickers. So this is a situation that, the convergence of what I say, disease, climate impact, protracted conflicts, and now terrorists, extremists, drug traffickers. This is a situation that no one can afford to have on their hands, despite the geopolitical rivalries that our colleague pointed out. This is a situation that I think ACO should pay attention to. 2 members are in the P5. Here, of course, our Western allies are still interested in Afghanistan. And here, India can play a pivotal role using its, contacts in the East, of course, traditional ties with China and definitely with Russia, and now, a strategic realignment with the West, and bring these forces together, create a consensus to at least have them deliver on their moral obligations for a nation that has suffered for the past 40 years, not of their own making, but the making of very much these players, those in the region and others outside the region, and the ways that our colleagues just mentioned that they have unfortunately fought each other with the Afghan blood on the Afghan land. So enough, that's our appeal to our neighbors. and definitely because we count so much on India as a large democracy, as a traditional friend of the Afghan people, with people to people, and with others, but definitely with allies as well with NATO. So we hope that they will at least come on the same page on Afghanistan and do their part to jumpstart this peace process and pressure the Taliban and the sponsor of the Taliban to produce a political settlement, and then deploy a peacekeeping mission and a much robust UN mandate, UNAMA mandate, to help maintain peace in Afghanistan until this inclusive government, including the Taliban, can stand on its feet and become a normal government again. Right now, it's not normal. These people are just a bunch of unknown or known terrorists. They're not made for governance and rule of law and running a modern nation state. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And I always love to read the stories about the frontier Gandhi, and hopefully that the regional players play the role there. Mr. Samant, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Indu Saxena. We'll have a short Q&A session for each of the experts. So to start with Dr. Hayat Alvi, insurgencies gave rise to authoritarianism, and the civil war scholar Terence Lyons has written that insurgent groups are able to deliver a degree of democracy when it suits their interest. So in this context, I would like to ask the following question. Taliban has emphasized the desire for normal relations with foreign powers, that it needs diplomatic recognition, trade, and financial aid. So will it agree to the international community and international organizations' proposal to establish an inclusive government in Afghanistan? So the short question is Taliban 2.0 more pragmatic than ideological as compared to Taliban 1.0?
Thank you for the question. And the short answer is no, because of what was said earlier about ideology. Look, the Taliban, the current Taliban, they want their cake and eat it too. They want the recognition for legitimacy from global actors and states. They want the foreign recognition. They want the foreign aid. They are pragmatic in the sense that they know that they need to support an economy in order for them to function. And what is their function or their role and responsibility that they see themselves as playing in Afghanistan? It's exactly what was said earlier, to impose violently, if necessary, their interpretation of Sharia or Islamic law. And it's in a very distorted, extremist, ultra-Orthodox manner. They see it in a very extremist lens in terms, and they're very stubborn about it, that there's no flexibility, especially when it comes to the leadership. This is their reason for existing, right? Their reason for existing. Taliban means students. They are the product of Islamic seminaries. So they're students, but students of what? They're students of jihad and jihadism and their extremist interpretation of Islamic law. So, and part of that involves extreme gender segregation. So no, they want their cake and eat it too. So yes, they want diplomacy, they want recognition, they want to strengthen the economy, but only for self-empowerment so that they can continue enforcing a religious, fascist, Taliban-led country.
Thank you, Dr. Alvi. Ambassador Alvi, what are your views on this question? They want international recognition at the same time, they wouldn't go in for establishing a liberal state in Afghanistan. Do you think that going forward, due to the pressures, internal pressures, as described by Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, that they would go in for a liberal government? or will it be a continuation of the policies which you have seen in the 1990s, late 1990s years?
Thank you. And just for clarification, I'm not an ambassador, even though I was a diplomat, but thanks for the honor. I hope to be an ambassador someday, but I don't have $1 million to give to the winning presidential candidate. So, but thank you. I always root for optimism. I had said earlier, I am not optimistic that much is going to change, that I think the panelists at least would consider beneficial to Afghan society. I think I agree with Dr. Alvi that the utilization of the international fora and the recognition is it's sort of it's just a showpiece that, they want to have, somebody sitting at the United Nations, to be there, to be recognized, to work with the international donors to ensure that, the basics of an economy can exist and get all that. But undoubtedly, their primary purpose is to rule the people, and to rule them again with this, as one of the panelists, maybe Dr. Alvi again talked about, this very perverse form of Islam, this one unique flavor that comes out of Saudi Arabia, that is not representative of the larger view or the larger progress of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad is famous for saying, peace be upon him, there shall be no compulsion in religion. The Taliban, of course, refused to recognize that idea and that thought. So I'm not sure what in the end, and you can use other sort of pariah states as examples, whether it's, North Korea might be a pariah state in some people's views. You can put sanctions on North Korea. You can do this or that. The people will suffer. The people in power will never suffer. And so whether you put, keep the full sanctions on Afghanistan, and I don't think they should lift them necessarily. The Taliban will not suffer with those sanctions. They would rather have a lower standard of living just to stay in power. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for your insights. Mr. Gill, given your insights into the past 1 year, what do you think of the situation going forward in terms of international recognition?
Thank you for that question. And in fact, as all my distinguished co-panelists have mentioned, and in fact, it's important to understand that that particular balance that the Taliban are trying to make is in fact not really going how it is intended to. And it is because of this that states in the international community are faced with a plethora of strategic ambiguities in terms of how to alleviate the suffering of the Afghans, but at the same time address the situation and the atrocities committed by and are being committed by the Taliban. So it is because of this that the level of international recognition continues to be uncertain. We can't really predict, the trajectory, but if this sort of thing continues, then I doubt that international recognition would be something that would be happening anytime soon. Rather, what we could be seeing now is that individual states, to certain degrees, try to engage with the Taliban in order to provide assistance for the people, and of course to talk about other areas of concern towards the people, and of course Afghanistan. So this is, I think, the maximum level of engagement we are seeing for the short term and the midterm. But as far as international recognition, I think there still needs to be a lot of work done to be able to address that gap and to really make the Taliban understand and constrain them towards providing the Afghans with the welfare that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. We'll go on to the next question. The recent UNHCR report showcases human rights abuses under the Taliban rule since August 2021. That's the month when the US withdrew from Afghanistan. And it shows grave concerns about human rights abuses against officials from the former government, journalists, and religious minorities. What role of the international community and the UN should the Afghan people expect and hope in for the future? Dr. Alvi, you could go with the question.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think a lot of that's already been addressed, but I actually would like to yield my time to Ambassador Haidari if he wants to address that further. Would you like to add anything? You're muted.
We Afghans would like to remind our friends, and especially friends of Afghanistan like yourselves, that we've watched this movie. I mean, everyone knows what the Taliban used to do and where Afghanistan stood. It was a no man's land. And of course, regional transnational terrorists under the Taliban roamed around. They masterminded 9/11, and that's why the Clinton administration fired those Tomahawk missiles once, but it didn't help. And that was a sort of the initial over the horizon action by the Clinton administration, which somehow the Biden administration, even as vice president, embraced, knowing that it didn't work. It didn't work because if it had worked, then it would have worked under the Clinton administration. He didn't, fail to use that capability over the horizon, but unfortunately, 9/11 did happen. So that's where Afghanistan is, with one difference. And there's a picture going around where it shows a Talib back in the 1990s whipping woman, wearing burqa, and now the Taliban, beating women with the barrel of the gun and a uniform. Both the gun and uniform inherited from NATO's premature withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's the difference. That they have inherited some $80 billion, probably more worth of equipment, including NATO equipment, and as well as increased revenues from drugs. And I completely agree with Mr. Ali that the Taliban are not affected by the sanctions, that they do get their revenues from drugs for one. Now they're also into ephedra or meth production and trafficking. And as well as, of course, the continued stream of funding that they get from charities in the Gulf and states in the Gulf, and as well as, of course, their principal state sponsor. So the Taliban wouldn't starve. So numbering maybe 2,000 or so versus the 40 million people of Afghanistan, it's the 40 million that are affected by the sanctions. That's why we propose these small sanctions that target the specific Taliban leadership and their, members of their principal state sponsor and institutions. So that said, we want the international community to address the root cause. It is the nature of the regime that has brought about this catastrophic humanitarian situation, that undoing of our freest media in the region, even freer than that of India, and all other gains of the past 20 years. So unless this regime as a problem, as an irrational entity is addressed through just jumpstarting a real tangible peace process that produces a sustainable political outcome based on the Afghan constitution, based on our gains, based on what the 40 million people of Afghanistan have been yearning and crying out for. Then these basically half measures, piecemeal aid interventions wouldn't help. It would be more or less the same situation as the 1990s, where the Taliban were pushing and then promising to basically ban opium poppy cultivation, which they did. And the international community welcomed that, and they were close to recognizing the Taliban. And the United States sent, I think, Ambassador Richardson to go to Afghanistan. Back then, the interest was in the building of the Unocal pipeline across Afghanistan. And so other such fringe interests, but we saw that all of that backfired. So we're in the same situation with a more lethal, more violent, more extremist, more equipped, with NATO equipped Taliban, with the super ego and morale that they now are convinced to have defeated. That's what they say. The rank and file say, we have defeated NATO. And if we have defeated NATO, then we cannot be stopped. Why should we share power with the rest of Afghanistan? We are the winners. We defeated NATO. We defeated the United States and its allies, and we are the vicegerents of God and Allah, and that's it. And even one of the chief intelligence of the Taliban in Herat recently said that if there are more terrorist attacks, we advise people to recite this verse from Holy Quran before they go out, in order to not be harmed by these recurrent attacks. That's how they believe. And then I just put out another clip on my Twitter where the journalist is asking, a female journalist, Western, a Taliban judge, whether a woman can be a judge. And he says no, and she says, why? He says that women have the smaller brains and they're weaker believers. And that's what they believe. So for this to change, unless the international community, in lot of their own shared common interests threatened by what's happened in Afghanistan over the past year, really takes concrete, tangible steps to rationalize the status quo. We don't see any change. We cannot keep the Afghan people on this humanitarian lifeline. It's not sustainable. We need $200-300 million every 2-3 months to keep starving Afghans alive. It's not sustainable unless we return to economic growth and proper modern nation state functioning in a system of international nation states, and with everything running as a normal, more or less, with the challenge that we see. But everyone is in line except Afghanistan. It's a very peculiar situation that the international community cannot afford to continue having as they did in the 1990s, and we saw the 9/11 as a lesson.
Thank you for the insights, Ambassador Haidari. Dr. Ali, your insights on the topic about the human rights situation in Afghanistan and what the people expect from the international community.
Thank you. I believe Ambassador Haidari has answered eloquently on that. And I actually have a hard stop right now at the end of this thing. So I'm going to thank all my panelists, thank the coordinators of this event, and I'll look forward to watching the video and hearing all the final commentary once it's posted. And thanks again for this opportunity, and we pray for Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the final question to all of you. Terrorism in the Middle East seems to have been widely decimated after ISIS and Al-Qaeda top leaders have been assassinated. And the US is shifting its focus from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific regions, so in essentially from asymmetric threats to symmetric threats to the great power competition, what happened in the Cold War era. So what is the long-term goal of the United States in Afghanistan while that nation is under the Taliban rule? Will it reinvest in Afghanistan, or will it become like something like Syria, a war-torn country where there is a civil war and people are suffering and no country looks at them? Dr. Ali, you could go start with the question, answer.
Did you mean me?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure, did Dr. Gill get a chance to respond to the previous question?
I
It's totally fine, Dr. Alvi. You could go ahead.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to be equitable here. Okay. I think my short answer is we, the United States, are very, very preoccupied with the current situation in Ukraine. And as long as that continues and gets prolonged, if that is the case, I don't think, it's just a guess on my part, but this is seen as a priority, and rightly so, for US national interests relative to Europe, but particularly what's happening in Ukraine and the potential fallout from that and implications for the surrounding area, and the threats coming out of Russia and Putin, that I think for the time being, we're going to be very preoccupied with Ukraine and Europe. That being said, when Afghanistan had the earthquake, the United States did help and offer assistance. But I think aside from those kinds of humanitarian crises stemming from climate change, earthquakes, and the like, I don't think, especially with the current administration, there's going to be the stomach for revisiting Afghanistan and taking on the Taliban anytime soon. It's also not popular in US public opinion. And until that changes, I don't think, unfortunately, in many ways, that there will be further engagement. Now, one caveat to that whole statement or answer is that Afghanistan does not have a purely military solution to the problem. Yes, the Taliban, all they know is jihad and fighting and violence. However, there are a lot of non-military variables that the whole world community needs to take into account to assist Afghanistan, the Afghan people, but without empowering the Taliban, in my view. Thank you.
Mankil, what are your views on the future of US-Afghan relations? Maybe the next decade I will pull out based on the assessment given by Dr. Hayat Alvi.
Thank you. And in fact, I agree with Dr. Alvi, and of course, taking off from the words of Ambassador Haidari, is that, as we can see, the trends in US foreign policy, particularly if we look into Asia as the continent, has been inconsistent, starting from President Bush, following President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden. So there has been a significant level of inconsistency towards cementing America's presence in the continent. Now there are challenges and opportunities here. The opportunity, taking off from Ambassador Haidari, that this should be the catalyst for regional players to really pick up the role and to engage based on the needs of the people of the continent. And this, of course, includes the needs of the people of Afghanistan. Now, because as we are shifting slowly towards multipolarity, we must look into other actors as well to really play the part in engaging and addressing a plethora of traditional and non-traditional issues in the respective regions. And while the United States continues to be the prominent and, of course, a primary actor in the international system, the emergence of other powers should also be an incentive to really address a number of gaps that have been missed by traditional powers. So this is also a challenge, but also an opportunity to address the gaps that have been overlooked. Thank you.
Ambassador Haidari, would you like to add something? We would like to hear your opinion on this issue.
Yes, again, building on what was just said, I think it's an opportunity for the region, and ACO just met, and I think it's a perfect opportunity. I know some countries are reluctant to get engaged on their own, but together they can do this. I think with India playing a central role, working with Russia and China, of course, now Iran joining SCO soon, bringing also Iran on board, and Iran-India ties have been traditionally good, and then also engaging with the West and securing their support, at least on maintaining what has been achieved with their blood and treasure over the past 20 years. Here, I think India also has an opportunity to play this role of consensus builder, given the geopolitical tensions, unfortunately, between East and West involving, of course, China, Russia, and the West on issues of Ukraine and Taiwan and other issues. But I think an opportunity for rising Asia that includes India, and India sharing values and friendship with the people of Afghanistan, and having observed for now decades the suffering of the Afghan people. I think it can and should play this role to help operationalize SCO, and especially operationalize its some of it is operational entities, what they call RATs, under the Indian presidency. That's another opportunity. India is presiding over, the chairmanship of the summit, and so it's a clear opportunity for India to engage our neighbors on Afghanistan. And also we are seeing a degree of warming relationship between India and Pakistan. Recently some news articles have come out, and maybe there as well, I think bilaterally, as part of their long standing tensions on Afghanistan and issues of terrorism and extremism on the one hand, but also multilaterally and within ACO. And ACO is really the situation in Afghanistan, and its rationalization is a test of what ACO can do in its very neighborhood. And I've challenged President Xi, if he talks about creating this community of shared future, that should begin right from next door from Afghanistan, where it can directly make contributions, but also using its overwhelming leverage over Pakistan, but as well through its relationship with the rest of our neighbors in the region. So the neighborhood of Afghanistan is the perfect opportunity. They have every capacity to do it, but they just summon up the and also in most cases, they're not democracies. They don't have to go through arduous processes to get that, like the United States, as it was pointed out. So they can easily help address the situation in Afghanistan. If their women and girls are going to school and universities, if they're leading in every way, if a woman in Pakistan fly F-16 jets, or if women do the same in China, and of course Russia, we know, and it was pointed out under the Soviets, they did things to help, and institutionalize that. And of course, with President Putin giving bouquets of flowers to each, female leader that he meets, why not in Afghanistan? Why not in Afghanistan? It's in the shared best interest, and they could not ignore our geography. We're right sitting, at the heart of Asia, and without stabilization of Afghanistan, it's hard to, really see how the vision of, India and Central Asia connectivity with Afghanistan playing our role as a land bridge could materialize, or, Belt and Road could materialize with Afghanistan, or, a stable Central Asia could be maintained in the backyard of Russia without stability in Afghanistan. With Russia knowing that, IMU and a number of other terrorist networks, and most of them Central Asians are sitting right across the border from Tajikistan, and Tajikistan is one of the weakest and defensible states. As well as drug trafficking, about which they all talk about. So every issue that we have discussed is on the agenda of ACO. So like Don said, it's a perfect opportunity. As the US is so busy, at least under this administration and Ukraine, and until another 9/11 happens, I agree with Dr. Alvi that I think folks wouldn't be interested in that also. But it's a perfect opportunity for the Asian leaders and the giants, India, China, and of course Russia with Iran coming up, and the rest in Asia. It's a perfect ACO time.
It was an insightful discussion from all the esteemed scholars. We thank you all for participating in the wonderful roundtable discussion on Afghanistan. It was a pleasure being with you all. It will be great if you could all share the discussion contents on your social media sites so that we can engage more people and take the discussion forward. I hand the webinar to Dr. Indo Saxena.
Thank you, Mr. Savant, for a wonderful moderation of this event. And I warmly thank you, Mr. Alvi and Ambassador Haidari, for making this very insightful. We will share the video link to all the panelists. And of course, we look forward to invite you in more round of events related to the South Asia. I see one question from the Jennifer in the chat. They want to know about the Russian. I would say in the answer that we are organizing an international conference in the first week of November. Please register for that. And it's on the titled Great Power Competition, a Challenge to the Rule-Based Order. Please register it at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, and your question will be facilitated over there very carefully and very attentively with the wide range of panelists. Thank you so much again, Don. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.